Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Collective Impact Forum, I'd like to welcome you to the Fall 2016 Collective Impact webinar series and today's webinar, How to Integrate Continuous Learning into Collective Impact. My name is Jennifer Juster, and I'm the Director of the Collective Impact Forum. Today's webinar is the third webinar in a three-part series adapted from sessions from the 2016 Collective Impact Convening, and these were voted on by attendees as the sessions they most wished could be repeated by webinar. We have a terrific program for you today with great speakers, but before we get started, I do want to touch on a few items. Over the course of the webinar series, we are talking a lot about collective impact, highlighting initiative stories, and presenting tools and methods for you to use. We encourage you to sign up for the Collective Impact Forum, a free resource for people and organizations to access tools, training opportunities, and peer networks going forward. In fact, if you want access to the slides for today's webinar, you can download them from the Collective Impact Forum website. You could also access those slides from the email you received, should have a link to the slides. And perhaps even the most simple is on the screen, you can actually click on the bottom right of the webinar screen where it says, click here to download your slides to get access to those slides right now. All of those are available options to you to download the slides. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and we encourage you to stay engaged with our presenters by answering polls and asking questions as we go. Periodically, our presenters will ask you a poll like this. And the question for our first poll is, how many people are watching today's webinar at your location? We encourage attendees to organize viewing parties for today's webinars, so we welcome multiple attendees from the same location. We're going to pause for a minute while you select the number of attendees at your location. Great, we see the results coming in. Definitely a few viewing parties happening out there. Terrific, so thank you. Hopefully that was pretty easy and great to see that we have groups and individuals joining us today. Other than polls, we want to hear your questions and comments. You can submit them at any time during the presentation via the white box on the right side of your screen. The presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as time allows during the Q&A. We also encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter using #CollectiveImpact. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can email customer support at blueskyelearn at the email address you see at the bottom of this screen. Lastly, this event is being recorded, and you will receive a recording link to your email after the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Hallie Preskill, Managing Director at FSG, who will lead us through today's webinar. Over to you, Hallie.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. Welcome again. I'm really excited about this content. I've been interested in learning for pretty much my entire 35-year career, and we really want to talk about learning in the context of collective impact today. So I am joined by two colleagues, Shiloh Turner, who's formerly with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, and she is now an executive philanthropy consultant. And there we go. And Efrain Gutierrez, who is an associate director with FSG, who works in our strategic learning and evaluation practice area. Efrain and I will be presenting some content, some framing, and Shiloh is going to be presenting some real-life examples from a collective impact initiative where continuous learning was embedded throughout the effort. We have three goals today. The first is to understand the concept and practice of continuous learning. One thing that I've learned over my career is that the word learning, though seemingly straightforward, ends up being quite a conundrum for folks. That we know we want to learn, but what is learning? What does it look like? How do we have time for learning? So we really want to help demystify and unpack what we mean by continuous learning, specifically in the context of collective impact. And then you're going to hear from Shiloh how she, at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, worked with others to weave in intentional learning into this collective impact effort. And then ultimately, we really hope that you'll be able to reflect on different ways you can integrate intentional learning into your collective impact effort. And we're going to be presenting you with some ideas and some examples And we hope you walk away from this webinar with some practical, tactical ideas of how you can embed and integrate learning into your work, and specifically around collective impact. So here comes the next poll. We're curious again who's participating today, and we'd love to know what role you play in collective impact. And here are the options. Are you part of a backbone? Are you a funder, a partner organization, or a technical assistance provider or consultant, or something else? You guys are fast on the buttons. That's great. Okay. A lot of backbone folks and funders. Great. Real variety of folks. Looks like we have representativeness across the different roles. Wonderful. Thank you. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. Our next poll is we'd love to know how many years you've been involved in a collective impact initiative. So if you would now let us know that. Polls are great. Really get a sense of who's online today. Okay, some folks haven't quite started, probably hoping to learn something here. And then it looks like we have a few mature efforts, and a lot of you who have been involved from 1 to 7 years. Great. A few more coming in. Well, that looks about good. Again, a lot of variation across. Thank you for doing that. Really appreciate that. So let's get into what do we mean by learning. I have a couple of quotes coming here. One of my favorites is by baseball great Yogi Berra. Life is a learning experience only if you learn. And I love this. It always tickles my heart when I read this because it really goes to the thinking that we need to think about what learning is and be intentional about learning. But learning is defined in a number of ways, but the two that I wanted to pull out here is that learning is the active process by which behavioral change, knowledge, skills, and attitudes are acquired. So that's got really looking at how we acquire new information and skills. The second is the acquisition of skill or know-how or know-why. And that's kind of another angle on learning. So we want to know how things are done. We want to know why things are done. But what I wanted to pull out and call out specifically is that as human beings, we're always learning, always. Of course, as long as we're breathing, we're learning. But the key to workplace learning, the key to learning within a collective impact initiative is about it being intentional. That means it has to be planned, purposeful, and it has to have a goal so that we can actually make the time and be really thoughtful about what it is we want people to learn, why we want them to learn it, when we want them to learn it, and where we want them to learn it. So if you take one thing away today, it's around making learning intentional and being deliberate and thoughtful about it. So my second quote for the day is one from Abigail Adams. Learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended to with diligence. And again, that goes to the intentionality idea that it's just not enough to say, oh, yeah, we're going to learn. Let's come together and learn. You really have to work at it. Final definition here, learning is a commitment to learning requires time, effort, and resources. That is to support ongoing learning, whether it's in an organization or in long-term partnerships or in learning communities. People need time to come together with a clear purpose for learning, with adequate planning and preparation, and with skilled facilitators. And last, before I hand it over to Efrain, I want to note that as you see in the bottom footnote on your screen, some of the content we're sharing with you today is from an upcoming publication of FSG that is called Facilitating Intentional Group Learning, a Practical Guide to 21 Activities. That will be coming out in January of 2017, so just a couple of months or a month and a half. And it is a guide that we hope will be useful to the field, including, of course, those involved in collective impact. So without that further ado, I'm going to share the screen now with Efrain, who's going to take us through the 3 elements of continuous learning. Efrain?
Thank you so much, Hallie. Yes, thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm excited to share with you some of our thinking around continuous learning and collective impact, and particularly sharing with you this evolving framework that we started thinking about and working with for a couple of years now. And as Hallie mentioned a few seconds ago, now it has evolved into other pieces of research and work, including the guide that we're working on intentional learning. So there are a few things I want to mention before I go through these framework. The first one is that this is, as I mentioned previously, an evolving framework. Is just one way in which we believe people can be more intentional around implementing continuous learning into their collective impact effort. But I want to invite you to think about what are the parts of the framework that work for you, particularly in your work, in the place where you are in the collective impact effort, the timing. So as I start explaining the framework, I think it's important for you to start thinking about how can you apply these concepts into your work. And then another thing, something that I also wanted to share is just, well, I'll move to the framework first, but to illustrate the elements of continuous learning, we divided the elements into three different things, and we think about it as a lighthouse. So imagine that the lantern sheds light onto topics of interest for the CI effort and rotates on its axis, which is the learning priorities. That's the number 1 there on the screen. Then the tower elevates the light, and the taller the tower, the greater the field of vision, as it is with effective processes and activities for effective and efficient learning. That's the learning plan. And the third part is the foundation, right? You need a solid foundation, a solid environment of trust and openness that grounds the work of the lighthouse. It's important to say that the three elements are essential for continuous learning, and lacking even one of them limits the effectiveness of the process. You can have a very strong agenda, with a really clear idea where you want to go, and have really good infrastructure, but at the same time, if partners don't trust each other, learning is not going to happen as effectively, and so on. So it's important to consider the three elements as you're thinking about implementing continuous learning into your collective impact work. So I'll move us along to the first part, which is the learning priorities. There is a lot you can learn about. There are like infinite topics, and you have limited time and attention. So that's why it's really important to think about and take some time to reflect on the areas of inquiry, the areas where you want to learn most about in the next 1 to 2 years. The priorities can be specific to specific working groups or to the backbone, or it can be more general into the collective impact effort. The way in which we like to think about the learning priorities, and this is just one way to do it, is by developing learning questions. And I'm presenting you with three different questions here that are related to different aspects of collective impact. The first one is around the operation of the collective impact effort. And the question we have here is around the extent to which leaders and influencers in the effort are bringing other stakeholders to the table. So if that's something that you're trying to do at this point, if you're thinking about whether you're being able to bring new members to the collective impact effort and what's working well and what's not working, that's something that you can start learning about. You can also learn about the progress that you're making towards your goals, reflecting on the information that is coming up from the shared measurement system. And third, you can also just start reflecting. Maybe you're very interested in changes in context, particularly now with our changing politics at the national level. There can be some learning that needs to happen in terms of the repercussions of some changes that might happen with the new administration coming in to your program. So we invite you to think about the learning priorities, and one way to do it is with the development of the learning questions. So the second part, and I want to stop here because this is the part that has been the one that has been evolving the most, is the learning plan. And the learning plan includes all the processes and activities to engage different partners in meaningful dialogue. And this is the infrastructure you need to develop to have continuous learning. But we started just with a more basic understanding of what these tools were, and now that we've been working on the learning guide that Hallie mentioned a few minutes ago, I think that we've been adding more content here. So I'm gonna try to keep I hope to be able to walk you along what's our current thinking around the developing of these learning plans. The first thing I'm going to discuss on this part is just what's considered data, and just make sure that we understand what are the different types of data that we can use when we do continuous learning. The second thing is thinking about when you are doing specific learning activities, you need clear goals and you need appropriate methods to conduct those learning activities and make sure that the learning is happening. And then we also want to invite you to find the right places where learning should happen. So I'm going to explain more about this. So the next slide is about when you think about data to inform continuous learning in your collective impact effort, there are three different types of data that you can use. The first one is just everyday experiences for members of the effort. You all doing great work. And you already have a lot of experiences, but maybe what you need to do is come together and share those experiences with each other and talk about what's working well for some and for others, and try to apply that to your work. The second data source, which is the most obvious, is the formal data collection methods. Maybe your collective impact effort is conducting an evaluation of a specific part or a specific program, and it would be useful for you to get that data and use it as part of your continuous learning activities. And then the last part is just sensing from context and communities, just having conversations with community members and keep the collective impact effort grounded into the community, into government, into different important aspects of context that might be influencing the collective impact effort. So that's the first part, is just an invitation to look at all these different types of data. But then the next part is like, okay, once you determine what your priorities are and you're ready to learn and you're thinking, okay, how am I gonna facilitate learning in my collective impact effort? If you already have a group in mind or a topic in mind, I think it's important to determine what is the goal of this group learning session that you're gonna facilitate. And we identified, and there can be more goals, but we identified three potential goals for continuous learning activities. The first one, and these are not mutually exclusive, so in the same activity you can be having the three of them, or you can only, maybe you're focusing on one. But the first one is to individually and collectively increase our understanding and develop new perspectives. So this one is about more discovery and increasing understanding of a specific topic. The second one is starting to generate ideas or solutions, is moving a little farther into thinking about the so what. And the third one is to make decisions. It's maybe your collective impact effort needs to make a specific decision, and you need to learn from different you need to bring some different information from different places to make a decision. So those are the three goals that we identified for different continuous learning activities. So this slide, I'm not expecting you to be able to read each of the lines of these slides, but it's also, once you have the goal, it's important to find the appropriate method for facilitating continuous learning. And this table is the table that will be included in our guide for intentional group learning that will be coming up in January. But this just gives you an idea of how there are different activities you can use that can serve that can serve you to be able to achieve the different goals that I explained before. So after you know the goal that you're trying to achieve, then you can start thinking about what would be the right activity. And to illustrate some of these activities, I'm gonna walk you quickly through 3 of them. Now, I'm not expecting you to be able to fully understand how to conduct the activities. I'm just giving you a flavor of what are the different types of activities that you can start thinking about conducting to increase continuous learning in your organization, in your collective impact effort. So I'm going to start, each of the activities that I'm going to talk about are related to one of the goals. So the first one is this idea of the first goal of collecting, of increasing understanding and developing new perspectives. We're suggesting data walks, which is an opportunity for different members of collective impact efforts to review data generated. It can be generated by the shared measurement system. It can be generated publicly by the census data. It depends on the topic that you're trying to do. But the basic idea of this activity is to write or print a set of data points in flip charts and put them around a room. You can think about having from 10 to 100 people. This works perfectly, particularly with collective impact efforts that have a lot of people in participation in a meeting and wanna have a collective understanding of data. This is a good activity for that. So you ask participants, you have the data around the room, and what you do is divide the group into smaller groups and spend 6 to 10 minutes just reflecting on the flip charts and the printed posters around the room. Have the small groups have conversations about what the data might mean to them, or if you have a specific agenda or specific questions that you want to answer, you can do that too. So then you bring the group back together and ask a set of reflection questions. You can ask about what patterns did they see in the data, if they saw any gaps, if there is any other data that they want to see. There are different questions that you can be asking to generate understanding and help everybody learn from the data. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is related to the goal number 2, which is to generate new ideas and or solutions. And this activity is what, so what, now what. And this is an opportunity for people, if people in a collective impact effort that have shared experience, if they went through a process together, maybe this is a good opportunity to just like share their understanding of what happened, engage the group to understand different perspectives, and start thinking about next steps and potential solutions. And the way this activity works is you can engage the group in 3 rounds of reflection. And each of the rounds will include 3 different aspects. The first one is just to have 1 minute of individual reflection, and then you can have 2 to 7 minutes of small group discussion, and then a small share out. So you're gonna do this 3 times. And during the first time that you did the rounds, you can ask the what happened, what did you notice about what happened, to start gaining a common understanding of these shared experience. Then you can move into the so what and think about why is this important to us? What patterns or conclusions are emerging? Do we have any hypotheses that we want to test? That's for the second round. And then during the third round, you can start thinking about what actions make sense to take. And this works perfectly to walk people from thinking about what happened and determining what to do, what are some of the solutions or some of the next steps that we want to take. And then the whole group comes together and discusses what emerged from the whole conversation and thinking about next steps potentially. And then finally, for the third activity, to make important decisions. This is a very simple activity. It's called Gradients of Agreement. And this activity is to make decisions. It can provide a way to see how aligned participants are in making a decision, or in particular in collective impact. For example, if you're thinking about developing a new strategy or going in a different direction with a working group, you can see, if you have a big group, to what extent are people in agreement in terms of the direction that leadership wants to go in. So I think if there is a decision that needs to be made, you explain that decision, the process of this activity. You explain what the proposed path forward is, and then you ask participants to raise their hand or to help you see if they agree with the decision using the scale that you can see on your screen. Going from 1, I do not accept this decision, to 5, I'm very pleased with the decision and fully support it. And that can give leadership a very quick but really relevant just snapshot of how people are feeling about the direction. And you can, in that same moment, if you have the time, you can facilitate a conversation and say, okay, those of you who said that you cannot accept this decision, why? Why is this happening? What are your concerns? And then those that are very excited about it, why are you excited about it? What are some of the benefits that you observe? So these are 3 activities that can help you increase continuous learning in collective impact efforts. And finally, as part of the learning plan, this is the last part. So we went from determining what data you can use in continuous learning as part of this work, and then we started thinking about what is your goal when you're facilitating continuous learning in collective impact. What are some of the activities that you can conduct, and now where? Now we invite also folks to start thinking about what are the places where you can create intentional learning. It can be both in new structures, or it can also be on structures that you already have in your organization. And this is important because a lot of the time we hear from the organizations that I work with that there is limited time, that sometimes it's hard and it's expensive. There's limited resources to do continuous learning. But what I say is that sometimes they already have some structures that can be used for continuous learning, but as Hallie mentioned before, it's all about being intentional. So, for example, if you're already having staff meetings every week, that many of you are, and when I say staff meetings, maybe it's a working group, maybe it's the backbone that is getting together, a committee, then use 15 or 20 minutes of your meeting to discuss a topic, to make a decision, to bring data and decide what are the next steps that you want to take on a specific topic. What I like to suggest is that you do it at the beginning of the meeting, because if you leave it at the end, you might not get there. Because usually, we all know that the topics that are kept at the end of the agenda sometimes don't get visited because we don't have enough time. So leave it at the beginning, make sure it happens, and that's a good practice to make it work. So you think about the structures that you already have. There are some on your screen right now, some of the different meetings that you could be having, or some of the different spaces where you can facilitate continuous learning. And there might be some new areas where you want to start thinking about facilitating continuous learning. You can have just like brown bags that are not necessarily every month or every 2 months, but you decide that you need to learn more about college attainment, and you bring together all your work group working around college attainment and invite an expert and learn about that. You can also have just have a learning retreat. That's something that we also sometimes do with our clients, where there is a day or 2 days of specific time where people, where there is an opportunity to just learn from the work that you've been doing for the last 6 months, for the last year, and really creating the space and being really intentional. So that's the learning plan, and then the third part, and I promise I'll stop soon so we can have some time for questions, is the learning culture. And the learning culture is really important because, again, you can have really good processes, you can have really clear goals and a clear understanding of what the learning questions are, but if you don't have the base, the trust, and then learning might not happen and might not be as efficient as it can be. So I think there are three things that I want to talk about in terms of the learning culture, and these are mostly suggestions around how to, for example, on establishing cultural norms that support openness, trust, and risk-taking. These are things that we have observed in our practice. I think it's important, for example, to provide spaces for participants to get to know each other. I think in my work, particularly, I remember my work in Miami, we used to have 30 minutes before a meeting just to have a drink, or to before we started the meeting, to have some coffee and just talk about our life, about who we are as people, what we're interested in, and just developing that trust. And know each other personally, and not only as professionals. There's also, it's also interesting to ensure confidentiality during meetings. Something that I haven't covered that it's important to mention is that continuous learning can sometimes be, it can be hard to bring data to the table, particularly when your work is being observed or evaluated in some ways by peers, by people that do the same work you do. So I think that, for example, you're bringing data from the shared measurement system, and that data might be just data that is sometimes, that can be, that is not as positive, or is data that is going in the wrong direction. It's important for everybody to know that the data won't leave the room, and that the reason to bring the data in is not to blame anyone, is to find solutions and to help each other, and it's just on the spirit of learning. It's important to be explicit about it, particularly leadership at the beginning of the meeting, just being really clear and say, you know what, we're presenting this data, it's hard, but we are all here to learn, we are all here, and nothing's gonna leave the room unless everybody agrees that what's the data that we are going to be able to share outside of this room. And then the third one is just developing a set of agreements for dialogue. I'm sure you've seen this before, where the group at the beginning of the meeting develops a set of agreements for engagement. Some examples of them are there on your screen. Are just assuming good intent, respecting others' opinion, being you can disagree but disagree respectfully. Those are just some examples of some of the rules that you can set up to make sure that the conversations go well, and everybody is reminded why they're there, and that everything is on the spirit of learning. So the second part is that is really important too, is keeping yourself grounded with community, with the context and with the greater community that you're serving. And here is gathering feedback and insights from community members. What we suggest is to be really intentional about it, and allocating the resources necessary to really bring those community members that you want to hear from to the table, and not allow systems of oppression to perpetuate the inability of some of these members to come to the table. If you need to provide transportation, if you need to have the meeting at a school in the community, then just do that. Which is related to the second one, to accommodate community members' needs. And then make it a two-way conversation. Make sure that you not only go to communities and get information from them, but also provide some of the insights, and explain what are you gonna do with the information, or what decisions you've made with the information that you've taken from community. And make sure you also create like feedback loops where community has also opportunities to tell you more about their experiences, and you can lift up those voices. And finally, the third one, fostering a culture of learning, experimentation, and transparency, is around leadership. So it's important for leadership to model continuous learning. And the first one to do this is to demonstrate a commitment to learning through the way leaders ask questions, the way leaders use data. So if you are a leader in a collective impact effort, start thinking about how you yourself how are you using data? Are you up to why? Why is this happening? Can we get more data on this topic? Do we need to learn more about this? I think that sends a really strong message that learning is important to the collective impact effort and to the organizations participating in the collective impact effort. This also applies to nonprofits and to different organizations participating in the work. And in line with that one is embracing failure. I think it's important for leadership to say, this didn't work, but this is what we learned, and this is how we're gonna do it differently next time. And the third one is just around allocating the adequate resources to be able to do continuous learning. Because if you don't give it the right time and the right resources, it's just not gonna happen. So I will stop there. I will, in summary, it's just these three components together create the opportunities for ongoing and intentional learning in collective impact. I hope this was helpful, and now we have some time for some questions.
Hey, Efrain, thank you. This is Hallie again.
Mm-hmm.
I saw some of the questions that came in, and I thought maybe I would take one.
Yeah.
So there's someone who asked, can you comment on why continuous learning is important to CI? Is it a shared value? Is it hardwired into the CI model? And I think that's a great question. And given my orientation is that collective impact is a learning effort. It requires people to come together and work in different ways and to share information, to share experiences, to share what they know, and to share what they don't know. And so it is probably the epitome of a learning group, just by definition of what they're trying to do. Because the whole idea is we all walk around with knowledge in our heads and learning about certain things. We all have knowledge and experiences, but until it becomes shared, it can't be the collective. It can't be collective knowledge. So I do think continuous learning is a fundamental premise or value or construct or whatever you want to call it to collective impact. And I think the reason why we're calling out the intentionality is because it needs to be built in to all kinds of different meetings and gatherings. And Efrain mentioned a lot about, the bringing data, but we don't want to discount the value of experiences either. So that we need to be able to pull out and highlight, celebrate, inquire into things that we experience as individuals or groups within the context of the work. And it may be observations we make. It may be things we've heard in conversation, assumptions that we're walking around with that we want to test. So the learning should always be, and as Efrain said, built into every time we come together. Is it what is it we need to understand? You remember that know how, know why, behavioral change and the skills. What is it we need to do together, and how do we create that container or space for doing that together? I hope that helps a little bit. So in a way, yes, it is a shared value, hopefully.
Yeah, and it's always important when you're dealing with a complex problem, it's always important to have that continuous learning present, to be able to adapt and continue to move toward solving that problem.
Right. So Efrain, I was going to go back. There's another question here, and I'm going to go back to the matrix or the table here. And the question, I can't do, there we go. Oops. The question is, the activities highlighted in one of the slides, which I think is this slide, which will be included in the guide, actually, are only for face-to-face learning? That's a question mark. Are there any activities which can be done online as well? Great question. Thank you for asking that. Why I was going to point this out later on, so this is a great way to do it, is if you notice, we'll just describe what's in this table here. First of all, there are three kinds of learning activities that we emphasize. One is the quick learning activities, and those we define as those that take like 15 to 20 minutes. So as Efrain gave an example at a staff meeting or some working group meeting, you have a packed agenda, but you want to create space for learning, for intentional learning. So maybe you pick one of these four or another. These are only 21 activities out of a whole host of many that exist in the universe. But one of these four, for example, are all 15 to 20-minute activities that could be used at the beginning of a meeting. The second section, the detailed learning activities in the guide, are actually 11 activities that are fleshed out and provided enough detail where you can actually facilitate the activity, so kind of step-by-step approach. And then the third set are actually already published on the FSG website, and these are systems-oriented learning activities or systems tools. So if you can't wait for the guide to come out in January, you're welcome to go to our website where you can find these right now, these last six. Now, in the matrix, to answer the question, you can see they're organized by what we anticipate is the ideal number of people, participants. This is always, variable. Sometimes some of these can be done maybe with a few fewer, maybe with even more, but these were our kind of best guesstimate of what we think around the effectiveness of the activity. Then we tried to give an indication of how many minutes, how long each of these would take. And in truth, many of them could take as long as you want, depending on how deep you want to go and how many people are involved. But that's kind of a rough estimate. So if you're doing some planning, you can think about how long it takes or how much time you have to do an activity. Then they're organized by the goals. And as you can see, the X's and the boxes indicate, which goals these particular activities are relevant for. And then the second part, and I'm getting to the answer to the question, is the other criteria. And we included two criteria. One is whether or not you want or need qualitative and quantitative data. So, interview data or survey data or test score data or health-related data, whatever it is. If you want, do you need data to facilitate this activity or not, or is it optional? And then to answer the question finally is, can this activity be used when participants are not in the same location, can it be used in different locations? So some of them, as you can see, can be adapted for people who are virtual and can participate in real time, in different locations. So again, these are 21 that we came up with or looked at and included in this guide, but there are many, many more that are out there in the world. Efrain, do you want to take a question?
Yeah, I wanna take another question. Yeah.
Okay.
So there is one about, and I'm interested to hear, Hallie, what you think, but it says, can you talk more about the resources needed? In a perfect world, how many staff will be needed to develop the learning plan and culture to collect and analyze the data? Does the capacity need to be held in the backbone? What models exist? I like this question because I like when I have the perfect world in front of me. No constraints. I think in a perfect world, I think it will be hard to have a team just working on this, just particularly thinking about, but at least having one person. I think that if there was one person in the backbone, it sounds to me that the backbone can be the right place to hold this person that is kind of the continuous learning person. And I think if somebody that wakes up every morning and thinks about this and how to, and maybe can spend a few months developing developing the priorities and the plan, and then start deploying, doing the activities and creating the culture and getting trainings. I think it's really important that this person has good facilitation skills and just ability to analyze the data. But at least having one person, ideally, I think will be great. I don't know what you think, Hallie.
So, of course, I agree, but I would like just to add to that. I think when we think from a coordination, a modeling, a championing of learning, people in the backbone, certainly that's a role they should play. However, I would also add that everyone owns responsibility for facilitating learning in all the different working groups and steering committees and other kinds of partner relationships. That I'd like to see it that everyone thinks about, okay, well, I'm responsible for this meeting, or I'm going to be participating in this meeting. How can I contribute to ensuring that we all are creating the space for reflection and dialogue, and that we are slowing down the process so we can hear each other, so we can offer insights, so we can do some sense-making together. So I think it's a distributed responsibility, but I agree with you, of course, Efrain, that for the intentionality to be woven through, to develop the culture, to develop the expectations for learning, it's a great backbone, role to play.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just add, Jen, I know you're listening in and you had a thought about this question as well. You want to chime in?
Sure. So this is Jen with the Collective Impact Forum. I would underscore Hallie's points that in addition to the backbone, having the emphasis on learning, especially as Efrain mentioned, having leadership commit to learning is so important. So having the steering committee co-chairs, for example, if you have them, or having working group co-chairs really emphasize learning, I think is very important. The other thing I would say is that some of the ways that we often get data to bring into our continuous learning process is through our evaluations, and often there are third-party evaluation partners that work with collective impact initiatives. So that's a different kind of resource, and the dollar amount of evaluators can range tremendously, but thinking also about an evaluation partner as a tremendous resource in continuous learning is also something I would mention.
Thanks, Jen. Let's see. Someone asked us to help find us where the systems-oriented learning activities are on our website. And thank you, Rachel. If you could go to fsg.org, they're under Ideas and Practice, and then under Tools and Resources. Mm-hmm. And they're tagged as Systems Thinking. So I'll say that one more time. If you're looking for the 6 systems-oriented learning activities, they're under fsg.org, under Tools, and then under Ideas and Practice. Excuse me, they're under Ideas and Practice and then Tools and Resources. So thanks for asking about that. Okay, maybe we have time for one more question before we go on to Shiloh's presentation, which we're anxious to hear. And would one expect more decisions to be made in the systems level type of activities? Oh, that's an interesting question. Let me just get there. Let me read that again. Would one expect more decisions to be made in the systems level activities? So as you can see in the chart here, we actually thought of those 6 activities, only one really being about making decisions, and specifically, kind of geared to making some decisions, forcing one to make some decisions. But, in truth, I could imagine if you do a timeline mapping activity or a trend mapping activity, you could easily have, at the end of that activity, say, we're doing this because we want to make a decision about a strategy, or making a decision about some next steps we want to take, or for helping us determine a particular path forward. So that's a great question. I think actually many, probably nearly all of the 6 systems-oriented activities could have this making a decision as a goal. And, we made some choices about where to put X's here, so, not to have X's in everything. But that's a great question. I definitely think so, about it based on what your intent is and what your needs are.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Was there one last short question maybe?
Mm-hmm.
We might have answered most of these that I understand.
I think maybe the one on, there is one here. Do you have examples of collective processes for developing learning priorities? I think one suggestion there's a couple of things. If you have the time, I think it would be useful to conduct a set of interviews potentially with different members of the collective impact effort, and think about what do they want to learn about, what are their priorities, and then you can synthesize some of that information and present it to the group, and then maybe you all together can then determine what are the priorities for the group. And I think it works really well if you do it in the way of questions, because then it's easy to know, like that's what you need answers to. But that will be a way to do it, just to have individual conversations first. You can also do like a short survey and ask for priorities. What do people are curious about learning? What would be helpful to learn about in their work in the next 1 to 2 years. You can analyze some of that data and then bring it to the group and facilitate a conversation where the group can identify the highest priorities.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Efrain. I think we should, sorry about that. I think we should go ahead and hand off the slides and the time to Shiloh Turner, who will talk about a really great example of embedding learning into a foundation's collective impact effort. Sound okay, Efrain? Okay to send it over?
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Okay, Shiloh.
Thanks so much to my FSG and Collective Impact Forum colleagues for the opportunity for a reprise of our session in Seattle in June. My short time here will be spent talking about the Greater Cincinnati Foundation's investment in collective impact, and perhaps to give you some illustrative case study examples of some of the ideas that were presented earlier in this audio session. So to start, I thought it would be helpful to highlight what the Greater Cincinnati Foundation's investment in collective impact was. And we provided 5 years of change capital or core operating support for a cohort of 7 backbone organizations. This was an investment of $3.5 million from 2012 to 2016. And in addition to providing this flexible change capital, we also established and convened a community of practice around collective impact. So let me pause and give you more detail about what I mean about a community of practice. In addition to providing the core support, we also convened a group of the leaders of the collective impact initiatives and brought them together on a regular basis, about once a month or every other month, to identify shared technical assistance opportunities to really learn across the initiatives, because our initiatives ranged from the educational sector to environmental sustainability to workforce development, community development, and economic development. And later on, in fact, even added to our community of practice arts and culture and some health initiatives. So while those aren't completely mutually exclusive, there are some overlap, and we felt that it was very important as a funder to not just provide the funding resources needed, but also to provide the space to establish a community continuous learning environment. And additionally, we evaluated the backbones to better evaluate and articulate their value with the work. And finally, I'll say it was really important for the foundation to champion the need to support the civic infrastructure created by a backbone organization, not just the programs that we invested in. One really terrific added benefit that I think I underestimated early on in our effort of convening the community of practice was really the incredibly rich cross-sector pollination that we experienced. So for an example here, you see the Cincinnati Music Hall, and what was terrific is both the Local Initiative Support Corporation in Cincinnati as well as ArtsWave were both participants in our community of practice and came together to talk about how they could apply both arts and culture to creative placemaking. And they were actually able to attract a pretty significant national grant to creative placemaking in a handful of neighborhoods. They also created a roadmap called the Blueprint for Collective Action to ensure that the arts are supporting our vibrant regional economy and enabling a more connected community. This connection simply would not have existed had we not been regularly meeting and learning from one another about what our opportunities for collaboration were. So in our first year of convening the Collective Impact Community of Practice, we spent the majority of our time working with FSG on evaluation, including the establishment of a shared theory of change, as well as identifying the 6 core activities of a backbone. And I'll list those off for you quickly, but you can also read the blog in the Stanford Social Innovation Review about those 6 core activities. They are guiding vision and strategy, supporting aligned activities, establishing shared measurement practices, building public will, advancing policy, and mobilizing funding. we built out indicators for each core activity so we could determine how effective each initiative was in these areas. And the results of the key stakeholder interviews enabled us to identify shared areas of strength, as well as areas where we could provide shared technical assistance to the cohort. So you see there that the areas that we identified for shared technical assistance included strengthening our ability to communicate about this work, the data use, and then building community will. My first example is around communication. We did convene, and we actually contracted with Andy Goodman, who is a communications guru that perhaps several of you have identified and worked with before. We were really struggling in the early years of our collective impact initiatives about how to really communicate about this work. Systems change work is very difficult. So what we did is we had a shared training opportunity that Andy provided that helped us better communicate systems change storytelling. And then he followed that on with crafting your elevator pitch, which really helped us put language around what the work is that we were doing. And quite frankly, the systems change training in particular really transformed how we talk about our work. From the foundation's perspective, it emphasized the importance for us to communicate the value of investing in the civic infrastructure, not just programs that work, particularly when it came to other funders in our community, as well as national foundations. So here's an example of data use, and we really emphasized the use of shared measurement, but also applied the data walk concept that Efrain referred to earlier, and in particular enabled us to disaggregate our data, and conducting a data walk with the cohort led us to uncovering several widening gaps in our community. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the top line data, the trend was looking like it was going in a positive direction, but when you unpacked it and disaggregated it, perhaps that was not always the case geographically, racially, ethnically, gender, etc. But it also helped us identify bright spots so we could study what was working and replicate or spread elsewhere in the region. And ultimately, the disaggregating of our data led to the understanding that we needed to be much more intentional about embedding equity into all of our CI initiatives. The foundation then created a 25+ person delegation to attend last fall's Policy Link Equity Summit, and several subsequent convenings have occurred since then. And now, currently, the community of practice is on a shared learning journey on how to apply an equity lens to all of our community collective impact work. For building community will, we determined that as a group, we were less effective in building community will than we were around some of the other core activities. So what we decided to do was apply a 6-month design thinking process specifically around developing prototypes to build community will. And I'll give you an example. One of the challenges was a 2-generation approach to increase advanced manufacturing workforce development for female single-headed households in northern Kentucky. This was a partnership of 3 of our collective impact partners, the Partners for a Competitive Workforce, Skyward, which is a northern Kentucky visioning organization, and then the Greater Cincinnati Foundation's Women's Fund. And basically, the barriers that were identified through these shared ideation sessions with the very women we were trying to reach for these careers was childcare, transportation barriers, and then general stigma around advanced manufacturing as a field. So we came up with some really interesting ideas that we have now begun to prototype. One was a family camp, which was basically a condensed summer coursework for parents working towards certification in advanced manufacturing, coupled with an academically enriched STEM camp for their children. The second example or an idea was what we called quote unquote tour the trade, which was frontline workers receiving immersive experiences in manufacturing facilities, which really debunked that stigma concept. And then my emergency fund, which was basically addressing if a woman is working through advanced manufacturing training and hits a roadblock, so for example, she has car troubles or something like that, this emergency fund can help her to address that need so she doesn't have to interrupt her training in order to continue in the program. Finally, I'll just highlight some critical elements that we've experienced and observed around building a successful learning culture. And you see that the intentional time, and you've heard this over and over again this afternoon, but intentional time and space to learn with one another, that it become a value of the cohort and that we really do build in adequate time and space. As I mentioned before, we convened the cohort every other month for a 2-hour meeting, and it sounds like a big time commitment. However, we've experienced that those are the best 2 hours of the month in terms of really being able to advance the work, understand what shared barriers are between initiatives, and get creative and working through those barriers as a cohort. Also, trust building between funder and among other backbone leaders. So when we convened the community of practice, we not only included the leaders of the collective impact initiatives themselves, but we also included other funders that were funding one or more of those initiatives. The third barrier, the third bullet there is the all teach, all learn philosophy. And I think Hallie referred this to you earlier about how it's really a shared ownership of learning that makes this a success. So further down, collective problem solving, I think, is an important element. What can we intentionally do together? And you've heard a couple examples that I've given to you about just by virtue of all being in the same room together and identifying and understanding what one another are working on and how we might be able to work creatively with each other is something that was a certain benefit out of that. Going back up to the shared planning and execution of time together, for example, in the data walk that was planned and executed by Strive, and the equity delegation is facilitated by different partners every convening. So it really does build to people's strengths around what they bring to the table, very similar to any individual collective impact initiative that you take a look at, where the partners, some partners are stronger on advocacy and policy, some are more strong on aligning funding, some are more strong on actual direct provider access and understanding, that sort of thing. So building off of one's strengths is a really important element of a continuous learning environment. And then finally, celebrating success. I think that's really, really important. And in this work that is a hard slog and very time consuming, it's so easy to continue to constantly be looking forward as opposed to taking a pause, stepping back, and celebrating the successes that you've experienced. So I will say that in our collective impact community of practice, we start the beginning of each year with the 3 big things exercise, which I identified here on the slide, which identifies shared opportunities. So you go, you enable each initiative to talk about these are the big 3 things that we're going to be working toward in 2017. And then, you'll go around the room and start hearing some, oh, well, that's interesting. That might be not exactly what we're doing, but I could see where this would gel and mix together, and maybe we could further accelerate our work across sector if we were, now that we are aware of what your priorities are as well. And then ultimately at the end of the year, celebrating success talks about, well, what have we really accomplished? Being reflective in your practice and enabling people to continuously understand and celebrate where we've been, as opposed to getting discouraged because it takes so darn long. So I will pause there. That was really just a flavor for giving some real life on the ground examples. I see some questions that are coming in, so let me take a few moments to pause and see if anyone else, any of my other presenters have anything to add based on what I've covered so far.
No, I think this is Hallie. That was great, Shiloh, and appreciate the example about a specific example of learning about how equity needs to be infused into the collective impact initiative. It's a great example of something to learn that we learn through the course of our work, through intentionality and through the design of a particular kind of activity or more. And I really appreciated also the all teach, all learn philosophy. I think that certainly affirms what we've been sharing as well. and the celebration success. I think that's, we don't do that enough, and around what is it that we've learned, and to celebrate our learning, and even our missteps or things that didn't work, because in the end, we've learned something that will help us be better, do better, achieve our impact, going down the road.
Absolutely, and that's why I really think that applying human-centered design approaches to collective impact is such a natural convergence of those two different models. Because when you apply human-centered design, you really are enabling co-creation and the emergence of additional potential solutions. And you can prototype, and no, they're not all going to work, but you might knock one out of the park and then be able to spread that across whatever service area or region you're working in. So I do have a question here. I see a question from someone that says, what do you mean by championing civic infrastructure, and how did you do that? So what I mean by that is, at the Community Foundation, we of course have our responsive grants process where people submit proposals to us, and we fund the most competitive proposals. But what's a little bit different, and I think a little more unusual to find in a funder, is the willingness to really fund that backbone organization themselves. So funding the organization that wakes up every day, thinks about the systems change goal or goals that they're trying to accomplish, really pulls together all the various partners and players, creates that shared measurement system, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all too often funders and particularly individual donors get the program support. They understand, oh, I'm going to support this organization and they're going to feed 50 children in a month, and I get that. But it's really, really important to have those systems change leaders, whether they are other funders, because in some communities sometimes that is what they are, whether it's a United Way or a community foundation, they serve as the backbone. But in other instances, and certainly in Cincinnati for the most part, we had to build that civic infrastructure. We simply didn't have those organizations 15 years ago, and so we needed to create them in order to really advance the agendas. And absent a backbone organization, we've seen that the big goals simply don't happen, and the data doesn't move or continues to get worse rather than collectively working toward progress. Another question I see is, can I give the SSIR 6 elements reference again, or the name of the article from SSIR? So yes, I will talk slowly in case you're trying to write these down, but the article is also available in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. I believe it ran in 2013, but if you just search on 6 core activities of a backbone organization, the blog should come up. But the 6 roles are to guide vision and strategy, to support aligned activities, to establish shared measurement practices, build public will, advance policy, and mobilize resources. The blog is entitled Understanding the Value of Backbone Organizations in Collective Impact, and the blog itself gives significant more detail about, well, what exactly do we mean by guiding vision and strategy, supporting aligned activities, et cetera. So hopefully you'll find that as a useful source. And I know it's available also via the Collective Impact Forum, but hopefully those core activities are helpful as you think about and organize your work. What was really interesting for us is we built out indicators for each of those 6 core activities, and it gave us kind of a barometer of where our various collective impact initiatives were more successful and were less successful, which then, of course, drove our learning agenda for how we could do some shared learning. And as you might imagine, some initiatives are more sophisticated and advanced in areas that others are not. So they weren't necessarily all shared learning opportunities, but we could then learn from one another as well. If we found somebody that was particularly successful at advancing policy, for example, and most of our organizations were less experienced in advancing policy, let's talk about how the successful initiative was really being productive in advancing policy. I'm taking a look at the other questions. Okay, so here's a question. For the community of practice, do you share facilitation of the meeting, or does the backbone group do it to be consistent? In the instance of our particular case study in Cincinnati, the Greater Cincinnati Foundation and myself in particular convened the actual community of practice meeting. So we organized the scheduling, hosted the location, for the most part, crafted and drove the agenda. However, it depended on what was being talked about. Some of those meetings were more formal and had a very specific agenda. So for example, the design thinking process that we went through was actually a pretty intensive 6-month process where we even had a third-party design thinking organization called Design Impact that really facilitated and drove that process. Other times they're a little more loose. They're we're at the midpoint in the year. Let's talk about what is happening in each of our initiatives and how we can be helpful, or perhaps there's a wicked problem that one or more initiative is trying to really tackle and would like the experience from the other backbone leaders that are in the room. I remember very clearly one of the backbone leaders said, "This is my favorite group because it's like bringing together a think tank, a special think tank of shared systems change leaders." And, you know, that was basically the resource that they used and tapped into to be able to solve those problems. Because it's an unusual way of approaching the work. And as I mentioned before, I think a lot of people are much more familiar with program investments or capital investments, but really doing systems change work requires that adaptive leadership and being comfortable in ambiguity and all of those things that it's helpful to have a support network and other people that have expertise in those skill sets.
And Shiloh,
So one more question. Are the collective impact indicators available? And yes, they are. I believe we could forward those to the participants after this webinar is over, but we do have, and in fact, the FSG team probably has those and could share those out. They're publicly accessible and available. So perhaps the FSG team would probably be the best resource for providing what those indicators are. And one final question that I'll answer, it was actually submitted during the first Q&A session, but I think is relevant to the case study that I just said. The question is capacity building under the Collective Impact Initiative different than continuous learning? And I think it is different, but very, very much related. And so the example that I gave about identifying what the 6 core activities were and then identifying indicators to measuring the effectiveness of those backbones in each of those 6 core activities were exactly what led us to identifying what capacity building needs our group had and then identifying what the opportunities were for shared learning. So very much related.
Thank you, Shiloh. You know, we have a choice here. We have another poll and activity, perhaps, or maybe another question or two. There are so many questions coming in for you. It's wonderful. Can you take a quick look and see if maybe there's another one or two that you might want to answer or be able to answer?
I'm reviewing them now.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for submitting questions. They're terrific. We want to maximize your time with Shiloh.
Another question is, are there learning activities that can be elicited by observation? And the example I would give to this is absolutely, and I think we, as a cohort, really experienced a lot of that during the design impact work that we conducted around building community will. So one example, very specific to the workforce example I gave you earlier, was what are the barriers to single female-headed households in reaching the advanced?
Just a moment. We seem to have lost your audio for just a second. And so if you could hold on just a brief moment, and we'll get that back up and running here momentarily.
Okay.
and go ahead.
Okay, I apologize for losing my audio. I'm hoping that I'm back. So eliciting by observation, yes. The advanced manufacturing example I gave earlier, one of the early observations that the organizations did was actually to determine how much of a barrier was transportation to these single female-headed households that were trying to break into the advanced manufacturing space. And some of what we did was actually take an example of an urban core address and where the advanced manufacturing employer was located, and then just how long did it take to arrive to that employer on the public transportation system, particularly assuming that at least one or more children would need to be dropped off at childcare along the way. And probably not surprising, but very eye-opening was just how long it would take, how early someone would have to get up to actually get their child to childcare, assuming they can even have access to quality care, which is another barrier and discussion. And then finally, how many bus transfers and how much time all told would it take to actually arrive at the employer, and then would they be on time or would they be late, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, those sorts of things, I think, can be elicited by observation and really just provide more tangible examples and understanding of the populations that you're trying to serve. And quite frankly, they have the best solutions because they're living it and experiencing it every day. So I think there's, all too often we value community content experts, but not as much community context experts. So it's really critical to include those voices in all levels of leadership of a collective impact initiative. I think that's probably all I'll be able to knock out at this stage.
That's great. Thank
but
you, Shiloh.
I'm happy to take additional questions offline. I'm sure my contact information will be shared.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. This is Hallie again. I really appreciate that. Well, let's go. We have about 7 and 8 minutes that we could actually do our last activity and see if we can do this. And let me grab this next slide here. So with the last few minutes, we thought we'd give you an opportunity to select one of the learning activities that are in our guide, but also on that matrix, and to see if you wanted to spend just 2, 3, 4 minutes just to dive into one of these or two of these, depending on how much time we have. So here's the list that we could talk about, and we're going to ask you to do a poll. So look at these, and of course you might not know what's behind the title, but if you're intrigued by one of these and you want to hear a few words about what this would look like to implement and for what purpose, we're going to ask you to vote. So take a look and identify the one that you'd like to learn a little bit more about, 1 through 9. Once you have your number, I'm just going to be quiet for a moment, and then we're going to ask you the poll. I'm going to assume you've got it. And there we go. So vote on which one you'd like to hear a few more words about. Wow, looks like we're getting a tie here. Oh, wow. Wait another minute. Okay, it looks like we have whoa. Okay, we'll call time. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you want to hear about collective story for harvest and Four Corners perspective change. Efrain, you want to tell us a little bit about collective story harvest?
I'll be happy to. It's an activity that I enjoy very much. So this is a meaning-making activity where participants are acting as thinking partners for a select group of one or several storytellers that went through a specific experience. So the activity allows for groups to connect deeply into dialogue and dig deeply into a situation happening to a member of a team, for example. So the activity is usually appropriate for 5 to 10 people. You can extend it and make it for more people if you like, but you will have to divide the big group into smaller groups of 5 to 10 people. To make it easier to explain quickly, I'm going to use a small group of 5 to 10 people. It usually requires like 60 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how deep you want to go into the story. So to prepare for the harvest, the facilitator, if you're the backbone leader, you're the person that wants to facilitate this session, you need to identify a specific experience that the group wants to learn more about, or a particular situation the team wants to reflect on. For example, if your colleagues are wondering how a coworker has established productive relationships with funders, that's a good situation where the storyteller can talk about how they develop those relationships, or if they're like facing a question about some negative feedback that they got and what's to be done next time, for example, with community members. That's another way in which you can engage in this activity. So you define the situation and then select the storyteller, the person that is going to be telling the story in front of the group. This is all days before. And then you need to give the storyteller some time to prepare the story and try to make sure that the storyteller they need to keep their own voice. It doesn't need to be polished. It doesn't need to be everyone. It has to be with the voice of the person presenting the story, but it's important that they present the main areas of interest for the group. So the only thing that you need to make sure is that the story includes important decisions, important things that are potentially things that you want to dig deep into. So the day of the harvest, you put the group together, and before the storyteller comes into the room, or you can have it in the room, but before the storyteller shares their story, you ask the group to divide to pick a lens or a way in which to see the story. And it gets a little tricky, but it's pretty interesting. So some people see the narrative, right? Some people see what are the people, the events, the stages. Other people see the process. What are the interventions, the processes? Another person sees the critical moments in the story. What are the learning moments, the breakthrough moments? Other people look at leadership. What is the role of leadership? What are the assumptions? Another person. Moments of joy. There are like different, or some questions. There can be one person just looking at what are the questions that this story is making you have. So each person has this lens with which they're going to listen to the story. Then the storyteller tells his stories. Usually it can be from like 10 minutes, 20 minutes story, depends on how deep you want to go. And then after that, the group takes time discussing what each of the team members saw based on their own lens around the story. And at the end, which this is really important, the storyteller shares what this person learned after hearing everybody listening to their story from different angles, from different lenses. And then you can extend the activity by then having a group discussion on what are the consequences. If you want to make a decision, if you want to generate new findings or new ideas, then you can extend the conversation and have a group conversation around what did we learn from this and how are we going to use it moving forward. So that's story harvest.
Great. Thank you, Efrain, very much. So folks, rather than trying to talk about Four Corners perspective change in 1 minute, I'm going to suggest maybe to hold out and look forward to the Guide to Intentional Learning that will be coming out in January, where you can get a lot more information on all 21 activities. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jen for some concluding comments.
Hi, everyone. This is Jen Juster with the Collective Impact Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today for our final webinar of the Fall 2016 series, How to Integrate Continuous Learning into Collective Impact. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. I know I certainly did. I found it so informative, both from the perspective of Hallie and Efrain from FSG, as well as from Shiloh Turner from the funders' perspective of supporting communities to use collective impact and to use continuous learning throughout their processes, both within their initiatives and across initiatives. So special thank you to Efrain, Hallie, and Shiloh for joining us today. You can find today's PowerPoint slides, if you have not already done so, on collectiveimpactforum.org. You will also be receiving an email with the link directly after this webinar concludes. For future tools and resources, you can join the Collective Impact Forum community. It is a website free to join, and you can then download over 200 different tools on collective impact at your fingertips. So a big thank you today to you all for joining us, and we look forward to continuing our conversation with you going forward. Many thanks.